Last week we told you we're going to start this year off with the ideal of if the plan don't work at first, don't change your goal, change your plan. And so that's what we're going to start with this first Sunday, starting this series off, because we realize that many of you have adhered to the tradition of this Western world. Many of you just 72 hours ago decided that you would make what is called a New Year's resolution. You decided to join many citizens of America and even those across the world, the practice. At the turn of this year, you decided to make yourself a resolution. The earth takes 365 days to orbit around the sun. It takes and it travels over 58 million miles to reach this point. So we are on the way to another 58 miles for the earth to travel around the sun to get to 2023. It takes 24 hours for it to rotate on its axis, that whereby we complete an entire day. By the time it does it 365 days, it has completed over 8,760 hours. So when we make our New Year's resolution, we're saying that we're going to put in the time of 8,760 hours to what we put in our mind. Are y'all walking with me so far? I want you to understand something. Now, I threw out those numbers because many of us say that we're going to make a New Year's resolution whereby we put in time to exercise because we want to lose weight. Well, however, you just understand that it's going to take you how many hours? 58 million hours to get to next year. So what you're saying is that I am going to put in the time to change my mental disposition. I'm going to put in the time to change my emotional disposition. I got to put in the time. I got to go through 4 seasons, because with the earth going around the sun, it causes the earth to transition through 4 climate changes, where you have winter, summer, spring, and fall. We're saying at the turn of the year that I'm not going to be governed by what the earth is doing going around the sun. I'm not going to be governed by 30-degree weather like this morning. I'm not going to be governed by 24 gusts of miles per hour wind like it was this morning. I'm not going to be governed by 100-degree weather like we're transitioning to by the time we get to March and May and June. I'm not going to be governed by 110 degrees weather when we get to August and September. I'm not going to be governed by if it freezes over and turns to 26 degrees, because my plan is I want to make a change. However, this is what we need to understand, that when we make a resolution, we are governed by the revolution of the earth around the sun. So your resolution has to be able to survive through the turning of the earth going around the sun. So you make a decision, and you now understand why it's so hard to adhere to the practices needed to go through with your resolution. And some of you sitting here and saying that I don't even practice this tradition, Pastor, but I want to let you know that at some point in time, you've made a plan. At some point in time, you thought about things that you wanted to accomplish. Therefore, a resolution is nothing but a simple plan that you put forth in your mind, first of all. I'll get into that in a minute here. But I want you to understand that in a few weeks, many of the women, you all going to get together because that's on the women's calendar. And you're going to participate in making a vision board. That vision board is your plan for the year. What do you want to see happen in your life over the span of these next 363 days, since we're 2 days down already? What do you want God to take you? Where do you want your family? How do you see yourself? How do you see your ministry? Where do you want to go? And you don't get there without a plan. And so there are people who have practiced planning things, who have practiced making personal goals, who have practiced to have a goal to improve their personal life. Nobody makes a goal to go backwards. So your plan is always for betterment. It's always for improvement. It's always to take a step forward, to progress forward, never backwards. Therefore, you don't plan your year out looking at your bank account saying at the end of the year, I want to be negative 1,000. Y'all hear me? But you plan your year out saying, I want to increase by 1,000. So our plans are for improvement, step forward, steps upward, never backwards. However, there are times where our plan don't take us forward. We see this in the text with David, whereby David had a step backwards. And he asked the question, how can I get the Ark of the Covenant where I want it to be? I want you to understand that this is not unfamiliar territory. Throughout the religion of this world, through the history of religion, there have been people who have made plans for a long time. The Romans would make a plan and make a plan at the turn of the new year to the god called Janus, where we get our word January 1st. They would make this plan to this god. The knights in the medieval time would make a plan of changing and betterment for their self-conduct, which we call chivalry. There are denominations of Christians across the land whereby they stood on watch night, January 31st, and they quoted words of covenant to bind themselves back to the covenant that they made with God. And I want to tell you that it is appropriate to have a plan. It is appropriate to make a plan. But however, we need to understand that our plan is going to take some time to work out. So the question is, what happens when I want to change my behavior, but I realize that it's going to take a while? What happens when I want to change some character trait, but I realize that it's going to be difficult in me shifting? What happens when I realize that when I join the difficulties of changing who I am, of changing some fallacies, some difficult traits that I have about myself, and I connect it with the length of the year that it requires me to stay with it? What happens with the plan? Many of us find ourselves like the man who stood up at the New Year's conference, and he says to the people, have you made your New Year's resolution? And he says to them, did you keep your New Year's resolution from the previous year? And then he stands with his chest wide and chin up high, about to pat himself on the back. And he says, I kept mine from last year, all 365 days of it. He said, I kept them, and I'm proud of myself. I kept them because I kept them in an envelope, sealed, set back in the top dresser of my drawer. Many of us have our plans sealed in the envelope, written on the piece of paper, stuck on the wall, put on the refrigerator, stuck in your mind, but you're not keeping it by working out your plan. Coach Val LaCour back in Mary Houghton Baylor, when I was there, told us as players, he said this, plan your work and work your plan. What do we mean by that? First of all, you must understand that when we have a plan must originate in your mind. It starts with a conception. It starts with an ideal. It starts with you waking up from a dream. It starts with someone striking a nerve in you. It starts and it originates in your mind. Have you ever had a proposal of achieving something in your life? Have you ever decided that you wanted to make an advancement in your life? However, you need to understand again that everything according to your plan must start in your mind. Without it starting in your mind, then you're going to miss the foundation that I want to lay here on this morning. David had a plan, something that originated in his mind. I don't know why it originated in his mind, but obviously it was something that got into David's mind. And David says this in the text of 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 3. He says to the leaders that had come to the meeting, he says, let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we inquired not at it in the days of Saul. What is going on is that David has this conception, this ideal, and now he has an inception. Inception means there's a starting point. So I have an ideal. So now I must have a starting point. If it's just staying on the paper, then it never starts. That's why Coach LaCour would say, work your plan and plan your work. You plan your work and then you start what you plan. Many times we will have a plan, but we never start it. So I want to have a better diet, but I don't go through the process of buying better food. I stay busy, so I stay at McDonald's, I stay at Sonic, I stay at Dairy Bar, and God bless him, I thank him for all that good food. But it's not healthy food. So I have an ideal of being better at eating, but I never start the process, so I never start the plan. Y'all walking with me so far? David says to the people, we need this right here, because the goal is something that you realize that you need. David's issue and Israel's issue during this time goes back some almost probably 100 years. And that is the Ark of the Covenant wasn't with God's people. If you don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, let me break it down to you. It is a wooden box about 2 feet high, about 3 feet wide. And in that wooden box was the 2 tablets that Moses wrote the commandments on. There was some sampling from the manna that God fed Israel with in the wilderness, and Aaron's rod. You know that rod that Moses had and stretched out? That rod was in the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant was a solid gold plate that had 2 angels facing each other with their wings coming together. And when the Ark of the Covenant was sealed, it represented the glory of God with his people. So wherever they went, the Ark of the Covenant with them represented God being present with them. They would house the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, in a little tent that was dedicated to God. Eventually, it became housed in the temple that Solomon built, and it was housed in the place called the Holies of Holies. It was the place where smoke came from between the 2 cherubims as a representation of God's presence with his people. And they believed that as long as the Ark of the Covenant was with them, then there was no enemy that could defeat them. But by the time that David had become king of Israel as a united kingdom, some 100 years prior to this, the ark was stolen and taken by the Philistines. Reason why? Because Eli, the prophet at that time, was raising a boy by the name of Samuel, but he had his own boys. He had Hophni and Phinehas, who were to replace him as priests. But Hophni and Phinehas decided that they would take the sacred things of God and use it for themselves. And God made a promise to Eli that I will cut off your family from being priests over Israel. And so God said, I'm going to kill them 2 boys. And Eli, you're going to be vanquished and wiped out. Your line will never rest over the top of them, of my people as priests, because I can't stand what you're allowing your boys to do. Therefore, there came a battle with the Philistines, and Israel was losing, so the men decided to call Hophni and Phinehas to bring the ark from the tabernacle. Are y'all walking with me so far? I'm trying to give you a good history here. And so by the time that they got Hophni and Phinehas to the battlegrounds, thinking that if the priests brought the ark, then we're going to win the battle. But what they didn't realize, that this was part of the prophetic word that God was going to kill Hophni and Phinehas. See, you got to be careful when you think something is prophetic, because it could be prophetic in the negative and not in the positive. Just because you're around God and just because you got some preacher that's acting like they're carrying God's presence don't always mean a positive result. Watch this. And so not only did Hophni and Phinehas get killed in the battle, but the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, the enemies of God's people, they took the ark with them, and it had been gone from Israel since that day. This is prior to Saul becoming king. This is during Samuel's childhood, and Samuel lived, according to record, to about he was 90 years old. Saul became king under Samuel's watch as judge and prophet. Samuel anointed Saul, and Saul was king for 40 years before he died. And now David is king, and David realizes that it's been too long that God's people have been without the Ark of the Covenant. It's been too long that we walked around here without the presence of God. He says, therefore, I call all you up to tell you that I got a plan. I got a plan, because I see that we need to be better. I see that we need to have a goal. Saul, when he was king, did not take the time to think about bringing God's presence back to his people. Watch this. Can I help you here? When it comes to myself, some folks say, well, is it hard pastoring people? And I tell them, no, it's not hard. It's not a burden to me. You want to know why? Because when I got into it, I knew I had to deal with folk anyway. I told you, you don't become a deacon. You don't become a preacher. You don't become a pastor. You don't become an usher. You don't become a matron or a youth director. You don't become a choir minister. You don't become a singer in the choir. You don't become nothing in the church without an expectation of dealing with folk. You in the wrong line of work. You have the wrong train of thought. That if you think that you're going to get in this business and not have to deal with people. This is a people business. And if you don't like people, then I advise you, don't never step up here. Don't volunteer your service to be a deacon if you can't stand people. Because you're going to find that you're going to have a conflict of interest and a conflict of value. What concerns me the most is the ideal that me as leader, senior leader of this congregation, it burdens me most to make sure and ensure that my character is in place. Why? Because Hophni and Phinehas and Eli caused the Ark of the Covenant to be snatched from God's presence, to be snatched from God's people because of their immorality, because of their character flaws. So I long not to be the one that causes this place to become empty because I'm not doing things right when it comes to my character. That's why I told you all when we was governing the bylaws, writing out the bylaws some 3 years ago, and y'all said, go ahead, Pastor. You can go ahead and write it because we done had enough of this field. And by that time, we was at the point where we was going to be talking about leadership. And we was at the point of writing it about how the pastor need to be governed here at this place. And y'all put it in my hands. And I went home and I wrote down that if the pastor does anything that is immoral, you have the right immediately. I'm trying to get this in your spirit here. You have the right immediately. Don't give him another chance. Don't give him some option. Don't say he's a good man. You get him out of this place because it's more important you to have God than to have him. And if I was writing it, I was thinking about myself. That's why I tell you all, if I do any of that stuff, y'all better know that I'm already messed up. Oh, I know some of y'all don't like that one. But I'm talking about myself. So now if I have that expectation for myself and I have the expectation, if you see that stuff or hear that stuff concerning myself, then you know what I have an expectation for every leader that's in this place. That's the burden. This is what happened in the text. David says, we've gone through 40 years with Saul, and Saul has only been occupied by his political power. See, this is more than just politics. This is spirituality. There is some political stuff that has to run through the church. I'm not ignorant of that fact, that there are some politics that plays in religion. But that is not the end-all, be-all. Saul was only concerned about increasing his stuff. Now David is the king, and David says to them, I want you to see this. He says in verse 3, again in Chronicles 13, he says, let us bring again, because we inquired not of it in the days of Saul. Saul should have known better, because Saul was old enough to remember when they went to the holy convocations. David was just a little boy, possibly not even born by the time Saul was anointed king, because by the time Samuel gets to David, he is around his adolescence time. So David came about during a time when there was no ark. David grew up in a time when there was no gathering of holy convocations, because there was no place to gather, because the ark was in foreign territory. But Saul was old enough to recall the days of going together and praising God. Saul was old enough, yet he did not inquire to bring the presence of God back. But here is David, who has this ideal, this plan, and he recognizes the importance of this goal. You don't set a goal unless it is essential to you. Y'all hear me? You set your New Year's resolution because it was important to you. You saw the importance of how it's going to transform your life. And so now David recognizes the goal and he devised the plan. But this is what David does, and I'm almost at the end. This is what David does. David says, I have a goal. I see the importance, but my starting point has to start at the lowest point of it all. Because David says, I'm calling all the leaders across Israel. The Chronicle text says that he called thousands upon thousands. Didn't even try to number how many people showed up that David called. He called every elder out of every town, every Levite, every priest that was in every town. He says, come, gather, because I got an ideal. Come, gather, because I got a goal. Come gather because I see the importance of this ideal that I have. And this is what 1 Samuel says. 2 Samuel chapter 6 says, it says 30,000 men. Let that soak in your head for a minute. 30,000 men showed up to Jerusalem to hear the plan that David was setting forth. 30,000 is what? Half of Brenham? Is more than Burton? More than Somerville? 30,000 men showed up to hear the plan. And David's expectation was that 30,000 men show up to hear the ideal. What are you trying to say, Pastor? I'm saying that if you're going to have a plan, you have to start at the lowest point, and the lowest point always deal with dirt. Let me say that again. If you got a plan and you want to execute your plan, you have a new resolution. If you're going to make it that 58 million hours, then I advise you to start at dirt and not start with a wall. David says, my dirt level is I got to get 30,000 leaders that's sitting in every corner and pocket of the country of Israel to get on board with bringing God's presence back. And he didn't start the meeting until the 30,000th man had stepped into the meeting. And David said, then, fellas, it's been too long that we've been living like this. Fellas, it's been too long that we've been without the presence of God. Fellas, I tell you that my ideal is to bring back the ark amongst us. And every man that was there agreed with what David said. But David could not move forward until he talked to the 30,000. Let me break it down like this. Many people want to build a house. Many people want to build a building. Many people, like us, want to build a building. However, what I've discovered in the process already, it is not a good idea to start building until we test the dirt. Lord have mercy. They call it, I heard my wife say it, they call it a soil test. Why do you need to test the soil when we put buildings on concrete? Because if the soil can't hold the concrete, then the concrete isn't no good. So you need to know what's in your dirt before you put some concrete and then put some walls up with studs. Y'all help me, Holy Ghost. Listen, so the reason why we need to know what's in the dirt, because that governs how thick the concrete needs to be. Because if the dirt is too thin and the concrete is not thick enough, then the dirt is just going to wash away. Jesus said, no, if you're building your house on sand, up on rock, because the rock is the solid foundation. And how we discovered in architectural business what is appropriate in thickness for the concrete is testing out the dirt. So if you don't put a plan together where you test out the dirt and get the dirt in line with your plan, then you got a plan that's going to fail by March. Many times we jump out and we don't test the dirt, and then we look around trying to figure out why it didn't last. It's because you didn't do the proper steps on the front side. And if you don't do it on the front side, then it's going to cost you more on the back side. So I'd rather put the money up front to get it back on the back end, not to get it on the back end and then cost me more on the front side. Because you to tear it down, that's money. You got to dismantle it, that's money. You got to come back and move that out of the way, that's money. When you could have just took it from raw dirt and got it right in the first place, and it didn't cost you as much. Oh, my God. So David says, listen, men, 30,000 of you, I got a plan. And this is what David is saying to them. And that is that not only is he saying, I'm testing the dirt, but David is saying, I got a commitment to this. See, if you don't have the inception, the starting point, then that demonstrates you're not committed. When we bought our house a year ago, we walked in the office in June. The commitment was paying earnest money. We wrote out a check and handed to the representative. We walked out the office, went to the dirt where we was going to build, looked at the dirt where we was going to build. We walked away, but what we did first was we handed them earnest money. The earnest money was a statement that we are committed to building this house. The earnest statement was that we have a committed heart that we're going to carry out our plan of watching the construction of this house. Many folk have come into offices. Many folks have walked homes. Many people have toured thousands of homes, but they leave every time without putting down money, which tells the representative of that company they're not serious. All they're doing is window shopping. We got to move from window shopping and make a commitment. That means you got to put something down to govern that you have some investment in what you're trying to do. You got to go and put some money down at the gym. I want to work out, but you don't have no workout place. I want to pump iron, but you don't have no iron. I want to mow my yard to get in shape, but you don't have no lawnmower. I want to cook better, but you don't got no pots. You have to put something down to demonstrate that you have a commitment. David's commitment in putting it down was gathering all 30,000 men, which means that a commitment is a conviction. See, when you have a commitment, then you have a conviction. And without no conviction, you don't have no commitment. And that is why many folk come into the Christian faith and they back out of the door because they have no conviction and they have no commitment to walking out their relationship with God because they have no commitment because they was never convicted. Ooh, Lord have mercy. I hope y'all are going to be with me next week. I hope I'm here too. Because I'm feeling good on this series. See, David's conviction was, I need to be in the presence of God. I need the Ark of the Covenant. And so he made a commitment because of his conviction. His conviction led him to doing what he did. What is your conviction? What is your conviction? Because what you are convicted with is what you commit to. So, if the plan doesn't work at first, don't change your goal. Change your plan. But to help your plan not work, check your conviction about your plan. Check your conviction about your goal. Because it may just be a good ideal, but it's something that you're not sold out on yet.